Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Babylon 5 Season 2. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review every episode of Babylon 5 one season at a time. This video is where I cover Season 2. So Season 2 of Babylon 5 is interesting. It has a really slow and rocky start, but gets good towards the end of the season as the main storyline of the show finally starts to kick in. Season 1 and most of Season 2 was basically building the groundwork for the main war story involving the shadows that began kicking in at the end of Season 2, and thus there are a lot of filler episodes and episodes that are very reminiscent of stereotypical episodes found in other sci-fi shows. In fact, I did find myself getting very frustrated with the season in the earlier parts, but was completely engaged in the later part of the season. But all in all, I do think Babylon 5 is a brilliant show. For those of you who didn't see, I recently did a top 20 favorite sci-fi/fantasy shows of all time, and Babylon 5 was number 16 on it, beating out some of my favorite sci-fi shows like the Twilight Zone, Fringe, Farscape, The X-Files, and Stargate Atlantis. So I do in fact think very highly of Babylon 5, but it was only 16 on my list and not number 1 or not even in my top 10, which I know for many Babylon 5 fans it would be. So that's where we differ a bit. But know that I still do really like this show. However, I do feel the strength of the show is the world building, the long-term story arcs, and it's absolutely brilliant at continuity and foreshadowing and carrying out long-term story arcs. Better than any Star Trek show, including Deep Space Nine. However, the execution of the show has a lot to be desired, and that's evident most to me in the first half of Season 2, where the characters are kind of flat and cliche, the only exception being Jakar. Now, don't get me wrong, they all have great character story arcs and are used well and great to tell a great story, but that's not the same as having fully fleshed out characters, and that's where I feel it falls a bit short of Star Trek shows, especially Deep Space Nine. Also, the acting is generally not that good. It's a bit out of date and melodramatic, and often the dialogue is very clunky and poorly written. This isn't even getting into the special effects, which if you look at other sci-fi shows that were airing at the same time as this show, like Deep Space Nine and The X-Files, Babylon 5 special effects are dated even for the time it was released, which is why I feel a reboot of the show would be amazing, as the creator JMS obviously has a very clear vision and is amazing at world building and slowly disseminating a story over time. So use that, but have better writers who can write good dialogue, better and more unique actors who can portray more dynamic characters, more original set design that doesn't just look like a Star Trek show, and of course, better special effects. This to me has the potential of being one of the best science fiction shows of all time. Babylon 5 as it stands is as great as it is, has a lot of flaws that I think many of the fans overlook because they're so enamored by the story, but that's just my opinion. Anyway, getting more specifically into Season 2, the huge mark of Season 2 is that the lead character, Commander Sinclair, is replaced by another character, Captain Sheridan, who then becomes the main character. This is a huge deal that many shows don't recover from. Apparently, Sinclair was written off because the actor who portrayed him had issues with chronic depression, so it wasn't a story decision. They were kind of forced to improvise and introduce another character. And you can tell from Season 1 that they were setting up Sinclair to be the central and most crucial character in the entire story, so suddenly getting rid of him and introducing a new character was quite a curveball indeed, and I felt that the show handled this beautifully. I was incredibly impressed with how well they managed to transition from Sinclair to Sheridan. Part of how they did this was by acknowledging that Babylon 5 is being introduced to a new component at a crucial time. For example, Garibaldi doesn't trust Sheridan at first and keeps him at arm's length, but as he grows to learn and trust Sheridan, so does the audience. So as always, Garibaldi is used as a surrogate for the audience. Also, rather than simply killing off Sinclair off-screen, they come up with a believable storyline of him going to Minbar, which fits with everything that they built up about the character so far. And just overall, the show did a great job of switching focus to Sheridan, who has his own set of strengths and contributions to the story that work in different ways. That being said, Sheridan himself was played by an actor who was very blatantly a handsome man, and it was hard to take him seriously at times. Most good actors blend in with their parts, where you no longer see the actor, just the character. But with Sheridan, I always see the actor, as he's just such a stereotypical handsome man actor. Even the way he talks is just like, hi, I'm a handsome actor. Not a real person, so I have troubles taking him seriously as an actual character. Even in the episodes that are written very well and are great character stories from him, every time he talks, all I hear is, hi, I'm a handsome actor. But that's just me. Season 2 also has has the introduction of a new character, Zach Brannigan, or whatever the hell his name is. Kiefer, I think is Warren Kiefer. If Sheridan was a great way to introduce a new character, Kiefer was the exact opposite of that, and was like the worst way to introduce a new character. They did this by trying to act like he was there the whole time, and it's just some guy who just pops up out of nowhere and says wisecracks and doesn't really do anything. It's every new TV character cliche come to life. It reminds me of the Rick and Morty episode where there were these creatures who alter the memories of the people there and make them think that someone was there the whole time, which is an obvious jab at TV shows that try to introduce characters and pretend they were there the entire time, like the Uncle Jeb or whatever. And these are typically goofy, shallow characters that add nothing to the show, and that perfectly describes this dumb guy who was even in the opening credits, but he barely appeared, had no character to speak of, and was kind of just there to be a cool pilot guy. It was an absolute disaster. They must have seen this because they did kill him off in the finale, and season 3 replaced him with a much better character with Marcus the Ranger. I guess it's the old saying, if at first you don't succeed, try again. So now let's go ahead and get into the episode, starting with Season 2 premiere, Points of Departure. So the main plot in this episode about the rogue Minbari trying to start a war by trying to frame Sheridan was really weak and uninspired. So this episode is more interesting for introducing Sheridan, which I already mentioned was handled very well. So it's great seeing him meet and interact with Ivanova. Now, they helped us along by having the two already know each other, and thus she already trusts him, which I think was a nice touch and helps smooth over this transition, because there is a real suspicion here that Sheridan was a Clark stooge, but we know that he was appointed by the previous president before his demise and is supported by General Hayes, who becomes a prominent figure in the anti-Clark movement. And it was interesting learning about his backstory on how he achieved the only victory against the Minbari during the war, and this makes him very unpopular among most Minbari. Now, this episode is significant also because we get a huge exposition dump as Lanier outright explains mysteries that have been teased since season 1, such as why the Minbari suddenly stopped the war against the humans and how Sinclair was significant to that. I think it's because they believe that humanity makes up the other half of their soul. So it was interesting to finally learn this, but the way it was just dumped all at once in a scene with Lanier literally just telling the audience did feel very poorly done. So you get the feeling that the original plan was to slowly disseminate this information through the story, but when Sinclair left the show, they couldn't do that plan anymore, so they had to just have Lanier just explain it right out. So that's a bit disappointing, but overall this was an okay episode. So next episode is Revelations. So this episode revolves some of the lingering cliffhangers from season 1, such as we get to see Franklin save Garibaldi's life, and Delenn hatches from her cocoon and comes with hair. Oh my god, hair. Now, I know she's like part human now or something like that, which exemplifies her belief that humans and Minbari are connected, and she will be ostracized by other Minbari for doing so, as they no longer see her as true Minbari. So this part of it is kind of interesting, but aesthetically, it just looked like she has hair. But yeah, this episode was okay as well. So after that, we get the geometry of shadows. So like many episodes this season, this relies on the A plot, B plot storyline. And the B plot is about Ivanova having to deal with some other alien weird customs and gets absolutely zero help from other characters, and this becomes a tired trope throughout the season. But in this episode, it was somewhat interesting as she dealt with the Drazi, who put on purple and orange armbands and began fighting each other all the time as they hated the other side with a different color armband, even though that was literally the only thing that made them different. It was actually good commentary on tribalism and sort of relating it back to modern society on how the group dynamic of us versus them argument is a bit ridiculous, but the storyline itself was a bit ridiculous and not executed in the best fashion. However, the A plot was even worse as it focused on the techno mages, which was basically space magicians, which was really ridiculous. It sometimes becomes too obvious that GMS was inspired by fantasy and sometimes tries a bit too hard to turn Babylon 5 into a fantasy epic, and it just comes off as nonsense, and this was a prime example of that. I mean, that storyline was so dumb, so this was not a good episode. So after that, we get Darkstar, where Sheridan meets his old commanding officer, and they get trapped in hyperspace and they're going to die, so they have to go out of their way to save them. Not much to say about this episode because it was pretty forgettable. I mean, it wasn't the worst episode ever, but it was pretty dull, so moving on. So next episode is The Long Dark. That's where we get Dwight Schultz, aka Reginald Barkley, playing a madman ranting about the end of the world on the streets. I mean, he does a decent enough job, but the character was just poorly written, and a ridiculous story about some monster coming and infesting people, and they have to try to fight them back or whatever, blah 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 blah. I'm sorry, but this episode was horrible. Next. Okay, so then we come to Spider in the Web, and this episode was actually pretty good. It was a really intense episode as it dealt with an assassin who was obviously programmed and not acting on his own accord, who kills someone that Talia witnesses, so she becomes his next target. But as they learn more about the assassin, they discover that he's actually dead and somehow turned into a programmed assassin the moment of his death, and they try to connect to the actual person. It was actually a pretty interesting story. Not the best, but still an enjoyable episode. So after that, we get Soulmates. Okay, so Londo's 3 wives come to the station. One's a pain in the ass, the other is a kiss ass, and the third doesn't really care about anything. Okay, so I think it's a bit hard for me to articulate how much I cannot stand this episode and how much it annoyed the living fuck out of me. This is the point where I think I decided I can't stand this entirely. I can't take them or Londo seriously as they walk around with these peacock hairdos and talk with what is very poorly European accent. Goes, yeah, it's just silly. And the very definition of poor execution. This episode showcased just how awful the Centauri were, while making it as annoying as humanly possible. Oh, and we get some stupid side plot of Delenn asking Ivanova how to comb and wash her hair. Oh my god, she has hair! Anyway, fuck this episode. Okay, so next we get to a race through dark places, which involves an underground railroad of escaped telepaths trying to escape Psycorp. So this is another interesting episode where Walter Koenig returns to play Bester, which I always appreciate as I really like him in this role. And the way it was done here was pretty interesting, as it really tests Talia's loyalties, and we learned that Franklin was the key figure involved in operating the railroad. And I thought that the way that this was executed was brilliant, as the episode doesn't tell you outright. You learn about it at the same time Sheridan does, which I think was a nice way to do it. Plus the resolution where they combined their telepathic powers to fool Bester into thinking they were all killed was a great way to resolve the episode. Again, not one of the best, but it was still very entertaining. So next we get to the coming shadows. Now, I'm not going to walk back what I said about the Centauri or Londo. I still think their execution is poor, and they come off as silly, and I can't take them seriously. But, that being said, they can be used in interesting stories and used for great storytelling effect, and this episode is a prime example of that, as this is a damn good episode. So, the Centauri Emperor comes on board the station, and he has, peace in mind and wants to reconcile with the Narn, and ironically, G'Kar wants to assassinate him until he learns that he is a man of peace, and then he wants to reconcile. But Londo conspires with the less than savory Centaur, Lord Rifa, and they assassinate the Emperor but make it look like natural causes so they can start a war with the Narn. This was an extremely powerful and dark episode that dealt with the overall causes of politics and dark part of the soul in powerful ways, and executed quite well, so definitely a highlight of the season. So next episode is GROPOS, and this was an obvious analogy to the Iraq War, the first one, in the early 90s, but it doesn't deal with the war itself or the politics behind it, but more of the troops who go to prepare to fight in this war and the people who farewell them before they go to war. So it's more of a support the troops type episode, which is fine as long as it doesn't get too preachy, which it doesn't. The war itself and the context of the show is just a throwaway war that doesn't really have any impact on the overall story, so it isn't the point. The point is the people. And we do meet some interesting people, such as the soldier that Garibaldi shacks up with, and those two guys that Zach Brannigan bunk with. But it's all cliched. Most cliched of all is Dr. Franklin's father, who has such a cliche adversarial father-son relationship, the likes of which I've seen dozens of times before, and this episode didn't offer anything new in that regard. So this episode is kind of okay, not horrible, but not particularly good either. It's kind of throwaway. So next episode is All Alone in the Night, which is a quote from the opening monologue, which I always thought was a very cheesy line in that monologue myself. In this episode, Sheridan is kidnapped and has to watch as other prisoners are tortured, knowing that he'll have to go through the same, and he dreams of Kosh, blah 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 blah, and really this is a throwaway episode I found boring and not particularly noteworthy, so not much else to say about it. So next episode is Acts of Sacrifice, which was a pretty powerful episode that dealt with G'Kar struggling to find support for the massive attack his people are suffering at the hands of the Centauri. It's fascinating to see G'Kar struggle to keep his people in line to the point where he's fighting them to the death as they want to lash out violently, but G'Kar, ever the diplomat, knows that would hinder the relations with the other aliens whom he wants help from. And what he wants is military support. However, both Earth and Minbari leadership refuse to give it, even though Sheridan and Delenn push them to. They want to help, so they offer G'Kar medical aid and transport aid for refugees and survivors, and it was such a powerful scene where G'Kar has to thank Delenn and Sheridan vigorously for offering what they could, but once in private he weeps because he was expecting a whole lot more. Very powerful stuff. Unfortunately, this episode is undermined by horrible side plot, which is an example of what I was talking about with Ivanova having to deal with some alien. In this case, these visiting aliens who hadn't been to Babylon 5 before, and they have an attitude of letting evolution take care of everything and weed out this weak. For the most part, these aliens came off as ridiculous and meager. Even the way they talk was annoying. However, I did like the bit where they complimented Ivanova on Down Below, saying that humans had found a way to weed out the weak and unwanted by letting them die. And was great commentary on our society, but this storyline is ruined by the god-awful ending where the ambassador insists that he have sex with Ivanova to finalize the deal, as with this race apparently having sex is like shaking hands. But if that's the case, would he have insisted on having sex if it was Sheridan or Garibaldi? If he was dealing with them? Somehow I doubt it. And it did feel like he was making a big deal out of it, so not really treating it like shaking hands, was he? Plus, the solution Ivanova comes up with is beyond absurd, where she does a little dance where she shouts out dating cliches and says that's the human's way of having sex. I know these aliens are unfamiliar with human culture, but they have to be total morons to buy that a little dance with no physical contact is how humans reproduce. Ivanova should have told Sheridan about this, but no, we can't have Sheridan involved in the Ivanova side plot storyline. It has to be just her, just for some reason. I don't know. It was absolutely awful. Still a good episode for the Shakar stuff though, but the awful side plot holds it back a bit. Next is Hunter Prey, which is another pretty good episode which furthers the plot on how President Clark is a scumbag, where a high-up presidential doctor who's an old friend of Stephen is wanted by the government and comes to Babylon 5 to hide. But Sheridan soon discovers that it's because he has evidence that will implicate Clark in the assassination of the previous president. It was a pretty intense episode. I like the cat and mouse, how Sheridan has to pretend that he's cooperating with the investigator when really he's trying to sabotage him. It's a fine line to walk. I found the storyline with a bull from Night Court kidnapping the doctor a bit less interesting, but not a total wash, so overall pretty good episode. Next episode, however, is There All the Honor Lies. You know, I thought we already did this Minbari trying to frame Sheridan for their own murder so they can get him kicked off Babylon 5 thing at the start of the season, and yet, here we go again. We do it again, but more detail. It wasn't interesting then, and it's not interesting now. This is just one main cast member is wrongfully accused of a crime he didn't commit cliche episode that I've seen dozens of times before in dozens of different shows. It offers nothing new or interesting, and it's beyond obvious that he was innocent in being framed. This episode was really uninspired and a complete waste of time. So after that, we get And Now for a Word. This is a typical cliche episode in sci-fi shows that I cannot personally stand. This episode is this type of episodes where normal events on board whatever space station or ship the show is focused on, we see these events through the perspective of a news team / documentary film team or whatever, where the entire episode is seen from their perspective and thus presented in the documentary format with like interviews and the voiceovers. And I cannot stand this. First of all, I'm not a fan of this documentary format. It has no place in a fictional show like this, and it comes off like a cheap gimmick because it is. Secondly, tons of shows have done this, from Stargate SG-1 to Battlestar Galactica, and I suspect even The Expanse will do this in the coming season. But you may say, now wait a minute, Mark, those shows all came out after Babylon 5. Well, first of all, just because it started a cliche rather than following one doesn't make it any better. And secondly, I'm not sure there have been shows that did this. There could have been shows that did this cliche before Babylon 5. I just haven't seen them or aren't remembering them off the top of my head. Either way, it sucks. Now, granted, the storyline the episode tells is somewhat interesting, where the tensions rise between the Narn and the Centauri. I just think this is a stupid format, gets in the way of it, so yeah, I'm not a fan of this episode. So next is In the Shadow of Zahadum, and I'll just come out and say it. This episode is fucking amazing. I absolutely loved it, and this is going to be a strong contender for my number one favorite episode of the entire show. This is the episode that, to me, most closely captures the magic of my favorite episode of all of television, the Deep Space Nine episode Duet. It has that same intense character drama in the bottle episode, all about an interrogation. And I must say, I always loved the character of Morden and thought he was one of the most foreboding characters I've ever seen, not despite, because of his cheesy looks and goofy smile. The fact that this seemingly goofy guy has the scariest, most destructive demons following him around, but no one can see them, is absolutely fascinating and scary. This episode is super intense as it follows the storyline of Sheridan becoming obsessed over Morden, feeling that he is somehow responsible for his wife's death. And this is amazing too, because they had teased the fact that Sheridan's wife died on a science vessel exploring the Outer Rim before. But in this episode we find out that the planet whose ship was destroyed on was in fact Zahha-Doom, the infamous homeworld of the Shadows. And Morden was on that ship with his wife and presumed dead, and yet here he is, perfectly fine. And this was super intense as Sheridan becomes obsessed and determined to find out what happened to his wife, as he could tell Morden is lying and up to no good. And he got so obsessed to the point where Garibaldi quit in protest, as Sheridan has no real legal reason to hold Morden, but still would not back down. We can surmise that the Shadows killed Sheridan's wife's ship, but spared Morden because he was corrupted by them and agreed to be their agent. It was great as Delenn and Kosh approached Sheridan and told him he had to stop and let Morden go, and his initial response was, "Oh, not you too. Why is everyone always bugging me to let him go?" However, they don't want him to let Morden go because he's innocent, rather because they know that he isn't. And holding him could risk letting the Shadows know that they're on to them, which would give up the element of surprise, which is by far the biggest advantage that they have. And I love how Sheridan wasn't immediately convinced by this argument, but sat with it until he looked at Morden in his cell and tried the different frequencies that allowed him to see the shadows in the cell with him. And that was a super intense scene that was very scary. And then Sheridan gives this amazing speech about how during World War II, Churchill allowed thousands of civilians to die in a German attack because strategically it was the right thing to do. And then he ordered Morden's release. And that was such a powerful speech that was delivered amazingly well. I must say, everyone was at the top of their game in this episode. But the one thing I will say that was a slight flaw to me was, again, getting back to the actor who played Sheridan. Even though I know he tried his best, I still couldn't help but hear that handsome actor voice come through in the scenes that were supposed to be like deathly serious, and I found it a bit distracting. But that's just a small thing. Overall, this episode was amazing. So after that, we get knives, and to be honest, at first I thought this episode would suck, as we get the silly Centauri thing as Lando's old friend comes on board, who's played by Jacob Carter from SG-1, and blah 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 blah. But they actually end up doing something interesting with the storyline, which surprised me. I wasn't expecting it to get good, but Lando's old friend was actually on the right side and realized that their current leadership is corrupt, and for that was being outed and called a traitor. And when Lando finds out that he actually finds this all out, he actually tries to stick up for him until his friend finds out that Lando is working with Lord Reefer, and then challenges him to a fight to the death, which he purposely loses so that Lando will have to take care of his family, who will not suffer consequences for his actions because of his death. It was a powerful story, and Lando could see firsthand that the people he was working with were no good. But let's talk about the B plot for a bit, where Sheridan gets a weird alien virus now, or like starts becoming an alien or whatever. I'm sorry, but I had a blast making fun of this storyline in a Mystery Science Theater 3000 type fashion. Like, when Sheridan starts seeing things and his vision went all funny, it was so obviously just like a screensaver. I mean, the effects are so average, as like any computer screen has these type of effects nowadays. So when I saw this, I shouted at the screen, "Oh no, he has a screensaver in his head!" And when he saw the dragon, the effects were so bad, I was like, "Oh no, it's a video game graphic! Quick, grab a controller!" And it's not just the bad special effects, but this storyline was boring and uninspired. So a decent episode, but not a great one. So after that, we get Confessions and Lamentations. So this is the episode where an alien species starts spreading a plague which they're in denial about, because in their history the disease is associated with immoral behavior. So they believe as long as they are righteous that they can't get it, and any suggestion that they have it they see as an insult. It's not one-to-one, but there is some commentary about AIDS hidden in there somewhere, that's for sure. Anyway, this is an okay episode. It doesn't have anything to do with the main plot. It feels like an aside, but that in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. But this episode has little to offer in terms of originality. I did find the ending where the aliens, the Markov, ended up being entirely wiped out, even after Franklin found a cure. It was really dark in a really nice way, and the implications that they allowed their own ignorance to kill them was fascinating. But other than that, there wasn't much here. So next we get divided loyalties. And although this episode wasn't horrible, it really pissed me off. Like, it was interesting to see the return of Lita and her revelation that one of them has been programmed by Psychor to betray them all and doesn't even realize it. So I have to give this episode credit for that. But what pisses me off about this episode is the very sloppy way they wrote Talia Winters off the show. Now, the actress was leaving, so there was nothing that could be done, and reportedly, JMS apparently has contingencies for a lot of situations, including the loss of main cast members, as the actress apparently just wanted to move on to bigger and brighter things. But if this was a contingency, then the execution had a lot to be desired. So, we're supposed to believe that she had been programmed all along to betray them, and even though there were several crucial moments where this program could have came in very handy, like, say, the Underground Railroad, they wait for this moment. Why? I don't know. I'm sorry, but that's some of the worst retconning I've ever seen. I don't buy it for an instant. And also, it was beyond obvious that Talia was a spy. I mean, even the first time I watched this episode, I figured it out pretty soon. And after they scanned everyone on the staff, and they were like, "Gee, I have no idea who it could be," I was literally screaming at the screen, "It's Talia, you idiots!" Like. And it was so beyond obvious that it wasn't Ivanova, even though this episode seemed to try its hardest to make you think it was. It was so clear that she was too obvious of a choice. There's no way it would be her. And plus, the whole relationship between Ivanova and Talia, I thought, was very poorly handled. Now, I heard another reviewer praise this episode and stated that he hates shows or films that go, "Oh, look, they're gay," and instead treat them like a normal couple. And I totally agree with that. But the thing is, even if this were a heterosexual couple, I think it still would have been handled extremely poorly, as they don't make it clear that they are a couple or that they have feelings for each other. And plus, it was not built up too well. It just seems to come out of nowhere. Instead, I would say it seems like the show was too chicken shit to commit to an actual gay relationship, and they didn't make it clear that this was a couple, and they were just pussyfooting around it, which I don't give them credit for at all. But whatever. As I said, this episode wasn't horrible, but it wasn't particularly good either. So then we get to the long Twilight struggle. Wow. this was a super intense episode. This actually, this is the episode where the Centauri defeated the Narn with some help from Morden and his associates, as they referred to them. But my God, was this episode dark and filled with a lot of sad moments. So it really works. And again, I'm not going to take back my complaints about the Centauri. I'm sorry, but I'm not. But they can be used correctly in Babylon 5, and this is a prime example of that. The scene where Londo demands G'Kar be turned over to the Centauri to basically to be executed, even though he doesn't outright say it. They all know that's the case. Was so intense because these two have been almost friends. At least, they've been working. They had a working relationship, and at times they almost respected each other. So to see Londo basically calling for G'Kar to be killed was super intense, and it was so awesome to see Sheridan stand up for him and Londo be unable to do anything about it other than demand his removal from the council, since he isn't officially an ambassador anymore. And overall, this was just a dark and intense episode that was very effectively set the tone for things to come. So really great episode. However, next we get an episode that's not so great, which is Comes the Inquisitor. And to me, this episode is the very definition of filler. It adds nothing to the story, just to say that Kosh doubts Delenn, so he sends an Inquisitor who turns out to be a human from the 19th century London. And this episode has me thinking that JMS just watched too much classic British sci-fi, as that's what this episode comes off as to me. Very theatrical, but in a cheesy way. I personally don't like this style. But on top of that, it's revealed that this Inquisitor is actually Jack the Ripper. Oh, come the fuck on. That's ridiculous. Star Trek already did this nonsense with the episode Wolf in the Fold, and that was stupid then, and is stupid now. So not a good episode, not at all a good episode. So finally, we come to the season finale, The Fall of Night. This was another great episode and great way to end the season. It was kind of obvious that the dude from the Ministry of Peace was a Clark stooge and was going to do something shitty, but Sheridan and the others took way too long to figure this out. But then when it was revealed, they were signing a non-aggression pact with the Centauri, and thus giving them free reign to attack any other world they pleased, as long as they didn't attack Earth. That was pretty cool. Well, I absolutely love the storyline with Sheridan protecting a Narn ship and going as far as to attack the Centauri rather than to let the Narn ship be destroyed, which led to them destroying the Centauri ship. And this, of course, pissed off the Clark administration, that then ordered him to apologize, but instead an assassination attempt was made on his life by some Centauri. I am a bit disappointed that there wasn't more follow-up on the fact that the Centauri attempted to kill him, or the fact that he destroyed a Centauri ship. This whole topic seemed to be dropped in season 3, but it was still a really great scene in which Kosh finally left his suit to save Sheridan, and it turns out that he appears as a god of everyone's own culture. So everyone sees someone different, they see their own version of what they think a god is, which I thought was pretty cool. But overall, a great episode. So that's all the episodes in this season. So now it's time for me to name the best and worst episodes of the season, in my opinion. So for the worst episode, it came down to episodes like The Geometry of Shadows, The Long Dark, There All the Honor Lies, and Now for a Word, and Comes an Inquisitor. But I have to give this to Soulmates. This episode had no redeeming qualities whatsoever and was just beyond cliche and an uninteresting, and oh, by the way, did I mention annoying? This episode was annoying as hell. It was so silly and over the top, and it overall damages the show because it makes it hard for me to take the Centauri seriously after this episode. But as for best episode of the season, for me, this came down to episodes like The Coming of Shadows, Hunter Prey, The Long Twilight Struggle, and The Fall of Night. But in the end, I have to give this to In the Shadow of Zahadum. This episode was just so intense, the right amount of creepy, while at the same time really delving into Sheridan's character and his dark obsession with finding out the truth about his wife's death, and to see him finally make that decision to let it go for the greater good was extremely thought-provoking and powerful. Definitely a noteworthy episode. So my rating for Babylon 5 Season 2 as a whole out of 10 is a 7 very good. This season was off to a rocky start with a bunch of subpar and ridiculous episodes, but it really made up for it when the main storyline kicked in and we got the shocking and melancholy Centauri invasion of Narn, as well as Sheridan realizing that this corruption is taking hold in his own government, and at the same time the galaxy's worst and most deadly enemy is returning to wreak havoc. A very effective and engaging story that was built up to nicely, which does a lot to add to the quality of the season, but still, it was held back by far too many poor episodes. So that's it from my review of Babylon 5 Season 2. I'll be back in roughly a month to review Season 3. In the meantime, you can check out my channel as I do many other reviews on other shows like The Expanse, Game of Thrones, Star Trek, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot for watching.